I want to thank our co-sponsors for the event, which is the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as the School of Sociology at the University of Arizona. Now, before we get to today's event, I want to briefly discuss the future of the Center for Ethnographic Research here at the University of California at Berkeley. As many of you know, the Center for Ethnographic Research is under the auspices of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. And the Vice Chancellor for Research here at UC Berkeley has decided to close the Institute in 9 months. We're not sure what this means for the center. I feel that closing ISSI, the Institute itself, will be a great loss for the center, no doubt, and for the campus and beyond. And I'd like you to join me in protesting the decision. More information is available at the socialjustice.org link, which is all one word, socialjusticefutures.org. And you can see this link, it's in the chat function. Now, the format for today's event is that we will have 2 panels of about 1.5 hours each. Each panel will have a brief presentation followed by a discussion. A PhD student at the School of Sociology at the University of Arizona is going to ask the questions on your behalf. Deborah Lustig, who is the Center for Ethnographic Research's academic coordinator, will be our timekeeper today and to help us stay on schedule. Then at 3, please join us for a mixer for more discussions. We will be using a different platform for that, but the link for that is also in the chat function. Now, today's event is part of a book launch, and the book is entitled Beyond the Case, The Logics and Practices of Comparative Ethnography, which is edited by Corey Abramson and Neil Gong, and includes chapters by many of the presenters at today's event. Corey Abramson is Associate Professor of Sociology in the School of Sociology at the University of Arizona, and a former graduate student at the University of California at Berkeley, and a person who was deeply involved in the Center for Ethnographic Research while he was here, and someone who was a key instructor to the Center for Ethnographic Research's summer workshop on qualitative research methods. Neil Gong is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of California, San Diego. And this year, he spent his time at the University of Michigan's program and on the Society of Fellows. Neil participated in the Center for Ethnographic Research's summer workshop while he was an undergrad, although he was an undergrad somewhere else. And he came back after graduating to be an instructor for that very same program. It is really because both of them have been deeply involved in the Center for Ethnographic Research that I'm very happy and of course delighted to host the event. Now it's my pleasure at this time to turn the event over to Corey to begin the introductory remarks.
Great. Thank you, Martin. I'd like to first thank everybody in attendance, our contributors, our presenters, our editor at Oxford, everybody who helped make this happen, especially Deborah, Max, Martin, and Elise, and of course, the Center for Ethnographic Research, which was my home for many years. I'd also like to thank Aaron Sickerell, who contributed 2 chapters to the book, but is unfortunately unable to make it today. As background, this conference is a culmination of a project which aims to articulate the value of ethnographic pluralism and elaborate the logics of comparison that we use. It has been 6 years in the making, and the reality is a lot has changed in that time. So before I talk about ethnography and comparison, I'd like to talk about our present moment in general and what is happening at Berkeley in particular. And I promise this is going to be relevant to what we do today. The fact is, 2020 has been a disastrous year for many of us. for our students, for our friends, for our families, for our research subjects, and human beings worldwide. In addition to the continuation of profound inequalities, both domestically and globally, the pernicious persistence and legacy of white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonialism, we are in the wake of a global pandemic. According to the data portal at Johns Hopkins University, as of today, we have around 300,000 dead from COVID-19 in the US alone, and this is likely a conservative estimate. The current moment has set the inequalities many of us have spent our careers studying into stark relief, from charting who society deems worthy of helping, to seeing who has to endure the dangers of frontline jobs, to who dies at the hands of police, to who gets healthcare, to the power imbalances that allow the corporate and administrative elite to disproportionately control the lives of the populace. Explaining these realities and how to address them in a world drifting towards post-truth is more necessary now than ever. This is also the time when the insights of social science are most needed. And for its part, ethnography provides a proximity to people in a way not seen in any of the other methods in social science. And this is related to the point of field work for me, which is that it allows observing action in real world settings in real time, which is necessary to produce ecologically valid data to answer questions of human and social scientific import. But this is not the only thing ethnography does, and this is one of the real points of this conference. For others, it's used to give voice, to extend theories, to flesh out critiques, and I believe all of these are important goals and in many ways are synergistic. But we have to remember that despite a half century of infighting over who lays claim to the real ethnography, we all share this. Our approaches place us closer to humanity than any other. And that's why ethnography, in its beautifully varied forms, will always have something to say about the past, about the present, and perhaps about the future. But the challenges we face practically, ethically, professionally, and institutionally in the academy and in the field at large are not minor ones. At Berkeley, my proud alma mater, the birthplace of the free speech movement, a class of administrators are using these unsettled times to advance their efforts to remake the public university in the image of their neoliberal idols. At ISSI, which hosts this event with the Center for Ethnographic Research, its centers, including SARE, are on the chopping spreadsheet, right? The window through which administrators view the world. And these places are truly intellectual venues that hosted meetings between students and scholars like Pierre Bourdieu, Theda Skocpol, and during my time were home to others such as Troy Duster and Aaron Sickerell, and they're gonna vanish. They're the birthplace of the UC's American Cultures requirement, which has required new students to confront our problematic history and racial legacy for decades. And for my part, as a first-generation college student who grew up in urban poverty, something I don't talk about much in my research, but is true, it was literally the only space for me in graduate school where I felt safe to ask my questions about navigating middle-class society in a way that most of my peers simply took for granted because it's where they came from, but it's not where I came from, and it's not where the other graduate fellows are from. And these things, again, are going to vanish because they don't meet a model of efficiency, corporatism, and narrowly defined individualistic return on investment that have supplanted the core principles of public education in America. They may vanish because those in power simply do not care, or my hope, are simply not under enough pressure to act. And this is not moot. These are the centers that disproportionately house and are run by social scientists, that are run by qualitative researchers, that are run by people of color, and that serve communities that do not generate wealthy donors whose names go on buildings. And I'd like to point out, it doesn't matter if this is intentional because that's how institutional racism functions. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. So I'd just like to say to the administrators at Berkeley, hi, from the chancellor on down, and to those who support their cynical utilization of our current historical moment to gut the institutions that have produced decades of groundbreaking research on topics like racial inequality and urban poverty, while they espouse caring about these very issues. It is agonizing to watch. It is transparent to many of us, but most of all, what you are doing is wrong. And even though my saying so may make no difference whatsoever in the end, it is still worth saying because silence is complicity. And with that, I'd like to change tone and point out to what really was the impetus for this project and where we are now, which is what is the role of ethnography as an umbrella for a host of methods during these plague times. The volume, or rather the idea for the volume, came up when Neil Gong and I were discussing the book we wished we had in graduate school. And we came to the same conclusion, which is that it would be beyond the case, but we came to this conclusion for very, very different reasons. For my part, the first thing I learned about ethnography as an undergraduate at Berkeley in the Center for Ethnographic Research, which at the time was the Center for Urban Ethnography, is that ethnography has always been an epistemically diverse field. It has contained traditions such as behavioralism, grounded theory, the extended case method, interpretivism, symbolic interactionism, ethnomethodology, post-structuralist humanism, and an ever-growing pool of emergent approaches. It's what makes it exciting. Yet so often when people write on ethnography as a method, or they teach it in their classes, this diversity is not acknowledged. And when it is, more often than not, it's strawmanned rather than represented fairly. And this is a real shame, as I believe each of the traditions have made amazing contributions to our understandings of social life. And while I think we all benefit from critique and serious engagement, what we see is often just attempts at erasure, just like what's happening at Berkeley. It's inconvenient, so people would like it to go away. And I've always found that disheartening. You see it when ethnographers operating under the principles of post-positivist scientific realism are evaluated by the criteria of literary humanism and vice versa. And to me, this just never made sense. It's akin to judging the narrative history according to the criteria of experimentalism. It's either confusion, misspecification, or deliberate inaction of symbolic violence. And this is something we're hoping to address because we feel that the move towards a singular model of ethnography, whoever's winning, interpretivists, grounded theorists, the extended case method, hurts the field in the long run because we're not a field about homogeneity. And just ask the generation of scholars who had to endure the reign of Talcott Parsons and his clique, who were convinced a segregated mid-century America was a zenith of modernity, how that worked out, right? We thrive with this diversity. Now, that being said, it's important to note, I don't think any of us are going to see other approaches as equally reasonable for what we do. And I don't think we ought, because if you think something else is more reasonable, then you should do that thing instead of the thing that you're doing. But we could still acknowledge the value of learning from people using different models in their life world, because social science, like our institutions and communities, are richer when diverse, and homogeneity and certitudes are the tools of reproduction, not the tools of change. And if 2020 hasn't made its point with enough bloody exclamation marks yet, it's time to change and it's time to be better. So, colleagues, if nothing else from what I say today sticks, please remember the following. Ethnography has never been one thing. It doesn't have to be. And methodological homogeneity makes us weaker rather than stronger. And so Neil and I have tried to show how, in a small way, with a lot of help from a lot of friends, how we could actually benefit from ethnographic pluralism. And we aim to do so around one of the core issues of method and measurement in all social science, and that is comparison. And so with that, I hand the virtual mic over to my friend, colleague, collaborator, and former student, Neil Gong, with whom I'm very proud to disagree on a number of important points about methodology. Thank you.
Great.
And here is Neil.
Thanks, Corey, and thanks participants, and thanks for everybody for coming today. So I'd like to echo the concern with the planned closure of the ISSI to be a major loss to both the Cal community and social science at large. And this volume, Beyond the Case, as Corey mentioned, was hatched in part through these various conversations we've had with people at the Center for Ethnographic Research, where I came first as a student and then returned to teach in the summer program. And so my reason for wanting the book during graduate school was I was trying to understand how to do comparative ethnographic research. And there wasn't a sort of single volume that brought everything together. And so why the need for a volume on comparison in ethnography? Well, for a very long time now, people have been conducting fieldwork in ways that are not bounded to the village or the neighborhood or the region. But while there have been important reflections on multi-sited ethnography that track connections and flows between places, investigating globalization and such, there's been far less devoted to what it means to compare across sites or cases. And the promise of comparative ethnography is that it's going to provide different analytical possibilities than a singular case analysis. So it might enrich interpretation through contrast, it might aid in causal inference, or show how different contexts shape ostensibly similar things, or on the contrary, show connections between what seem at first blush to be very different kinds of analytical objects. And it potentially offers different ways to think about generalizability or other issues that often come up for qualitative researchers. So this is a potential payoff, but comparison is also fraught with various kinds of methodological questions. Are the sites, cases, or people under study truly comparable? Does rendering them comparable require too much reduction, which might contradict at least some forms of ethnography that emphasize detailed, thick description? So these are some of the kinds of questions that we'll address throughout the day and are addressed in the volume. And ethnographers have long acknowledged both this potential payoff of comparison and the methodological difficulty. And as the anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard once quipped, there is only one method, the comparative method, and that is impossible. So again, hinting at both, there are these payoffs, but it produces these difficulties analytically. And so that grand old anthropological tradition was trying to create these massive databases of different societies using things like the human research area files, so you could compare, say, kinship in a number of different places. But this approach was eventually rejected in anthropology for a variety of reasons. It tended to homogenize internal variation within a given society and take those units of societies for granted. Often descended in these sort of normative claims about so-called primitive societies versus modern ones, and this is all roundly rejected after the post-colonial and post-structuralist turns. In sociology, on the other hand, we've seen classic works that compare at much smaller scales than whole societies. So for instance, writings on gangs in different cities, child rearing across social classes, factories across borders. Corey's work now on aging in different neighborhoods and communities. And so one model we saw for the volume was looking at the development of comparative historical methods at the intersection of sociology, political science, and history. In the 80s, people like Theda Skocpol and Margaret Summers were reflecting on what comparison offered. And they found themselves trapped between different positions. Quantitative scholars who often rejected the individual case studies as non-scientific, and on the other hand, some historians who believed that things were too unique to really be compared. And so they're attempting to find potential middle grounds or completely different approaches with rigorous case comparison. And this is similar to the position of ethnographers, who are often caught between quantitative researchers on the one hand and humanities influenced thinkers on the other, who sometimes reject generalization in total. So Corey and I hope to produce with this volume like a series of dialogues that would be akin to some of these comparative historical methods books, but of course now focused on field research. And as Corey noted, ethnography is not a single method. There are numerous diverse ways that people approach different aspects of field research and comparison. So ethnographers vary substantially in how they use comparison. They vary on what they compare, whether that's people, cases, variables, mechanisms, understandings, sites, or situations. They'll vary in their mode of comparison, and they'll vary in the goals of comparison, whether one's trying to establish generalizable patterns of behavior, showing variation in socio-historical contexts, uncovering causal mechanisms, or allowing more imaginative theorizing. And so this resulting volume, Beyond the Case, includes fantastic contributions from scholars across a range of traditions. In our introduction and conclusion, attempt to to synthesize some of these ideas, also a comparison of different comparative logics, of where things actually align more than you'd think and where they are somewhat incommensurable. And at the introduction of part 2 for the second panel, I'll say a little bit more about this synthetic analytic work. And if you find these discussions today useful and want to engage more, we hope you'll check out the book. So now we'll turn to our first speaker. I'll begin by reintroducing Martin Sanchez-Jankowski. Martin is professor of sociology at UC Berkeley and the chair of the Center for Ethnographic Research. And I worked for Martin as an RA before graduate school, and his thinking has helped shape mine for quite a long time. So Martin, if you'd like to kick us off.
Martin, you're still muted.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give you today a skeletal version of the behavioral approach to ethnography, and in it, I'm going to look at priors to the approach, design of the approach, execution of the approach, and the products of the approach. I want to caution you that this is really very skimming, and so if you want to really have a better idea about all of these things, please consult the first 2 chapters in the book Beyond the Case. The behavioral approach is using participant observation of behavior on living people and not people who are dead. Ethnography can, in fact, before anybody find that amusing, the ethnography tradition can actually study people who have passed away, but this approach actually is highlighted by the fact that it's actually going to study people who are living. The epistemological origins of the behavioral approach are in the realist philosophical tradition. I won't say more about it, although it's actually in the chapter itself and outlines that. Now, the design of the approach essentially comes in like something like this. It requires to be a question to be answered. That is, to actually determine a question that's to be answered empirically, not theoretically, and making sure that that question that you're going to study is appropriate for the method that you're actually going to use. And in that, avoiding any question that has to do with how many people have this or that, how much of these people have this or that. That requires another method if you're interested in that, because the total ends of people that are going to be studied are not going to be appropriate for answering that question. And so within this behavioral tradition, that is considered really upfront before proceeding. The next step in the design is to see who you're going to study or what you're going to study, and to make sure that whatever that you decide is representative of that category. That is to say that it's not a biased sample that is actually going to prove something you already know or you think you know. And that has to do with the question, too. If you already know the answer, why actually do the research? The behavioralist approach is actually predicated on the idea that you do not know the answer, and that's why you are doing the research. So having an idea about what that represents, that is the representative sample that you're going to use, is terribly important for your ability to generalize afterwards. Making the sample comparative is terribly important from the behavioral approach. Why is it important? Because it creates variance. And variance is terribly important in the analytic stage because it allows you to tell what is different among different groups of people at different times and in different locations, and why that actually is the case. It also allows you to see what's the same between peoples and situations and times, and why it is the same. Now, after you've established a comparative approach to what you want to study, then you're faced with the execution of the research project. Within the behavioralist tradition, execution takes seriously, and I can't emphasize this enough, issues having to do with validity, both internal and external. And how that actually works in this method is that the categories that you're utilizing in order to, in terms of data gathering, have to be consistent with what also exists for that category in the theoretical and empirical research, or if it's different, to define it in a way that makes sense for the people who will read it later. And it also takes seriously the issue of reliability, because without being terribly reliable, the confidence that you want to have in presenting it out to the general public in terms of generalizations will, of course, be somewhat suspect. That is to say, you won't have the confidence that what you're generalizing is actually exists. Now, in the execution, this approach takes systematic recording of behavior terribly important. That means recording behaviors that you've seen over and over again, and that's boring to take because without the consistency in behaviors, there's no way to establish a pattern. And it is at the pattern that is the most important element in the analysis stage of the behavioral approach. A pattern, of course, is being taken as the raw numbers of times in which you have observed and recorded a specific behavior in particular situations. And this can be aided, that is, in your data gathering phase, by using computer-assisted software, which I highly recommend, and is preferable, though not, of course, required. Now, what's the product of this at the end? And I'll try to be very brief. The product at the end of this research project for this particular approach is to first establish understanding when, where, and how the behaviors under study occurred. And this leads to the second element of this approach, which is to explain what the behaviors mean for some element of society or society itself. And this leads to the third element of the behavioral approach, which is the ability to predict behaviors under similar situations. Now, establishing both understanding, explanation, and prediction, which are fundamental for this approach, contributes within the academy, first, the affirmation of some elements of existing theory, and or the development of new micro or meso level theories of behavior. But in addition to the academy, this approach can and has been used within the policy establishment to directly assist in the development and implementation of public policy. And I dare say it's not the only one that can be used, perhaps, of all the traditions, but it is without doubt the primary one that will be used in the policy arena, because in the policy arena, the languages that are spoken in among other traditions, while appropriate for the academy, have very difficulty being translated into the kinds of language public policy needs, both at the governmental and non-governmental level, in order to move forward on their projects. And with that, I actually will stop.
All right, thank you so much, Martin. Next, we'll turn to Stefan Timmermans, my chair of my dissertation committee. Great chance have a chance to introduce him, as well as Ido Tavori. So Stefan is professor of sociology at UCLA. And Ido is associate professor of sociology at NYU, although I believe it's just Stefan who will be speaking. Stefan.
Hello, everyone. Hello,
just for moral support.
It's a tremendous pleasure to be here and see all of you ethnographers zooming together. I do feel a little bit seen by Martine's opening comments because I'm actually an ethnographer of dead people. I study dead, dying, mourning, dead people, unclaimed deaths, and I can tell you it's a lot of fun. So my task today is to share some thoughts Ido and I have about comparative ethnography, and they're not just in this chapter, but they're also a little bit of foreshadowing a book that is forthcoming next year, just called Surprise Abductive Analysis in Action. And some of the thoughts there carry over. It's more of a how-to book on what we have been developing on abductive analysis. So we are a little bit on the more skeptical side of comparative ethnography. And we don't see comparisons as a form of research insurance that by definition will make any kind of research project better, even though there is a very seductive quality by going the comparative route. But what we see in reading the literature is that it can be done in a very mechanical fashion, in a way that actually stifles analytical insights rather than generating them. And this is probably the bigger problem. It often fails. And so now this is where there's a benefit of having a co-author, because if I had written this chapter by myself, I would have given you lots of examples of failed comparisons. But Ido, being such a nice guy, he said to take them all out and just talk about it in general. But generally, the reason why comparative ethnographies tend to fail is either that the sites end up being too different, making a comparison moot, or, and that's even more common, they sort of collapse into one site. So you have two people going to two different populations, two different sites, but then they write about it as if it's one side. And then the third element to be cautious about comparisons is that they require a lot of work. You're basically doubling the kind of work you put into your research. So the bar for a comparison should be very high. And you might be better off spending more time in one site rather than maybe doing a comparison. So our thinking, our thoughts today is about how, if you want to take this comparative route, is how can you stack the deck in your favor? And there are two ways by which there's actually a much lower bar, where most ethnographers already are doing comparisons. And one is, we call in the chapter, the internal comparisons, which is a carryover of grounded theory, which was also called the constant comparative methods. And here the idea is that when you're analyzing data, you're comparing one observation against another, looking for variation, and then trying to make analytically sense of these variations. And there's this constant going back and forth between observations and fitting them in and looking at them as a way of doing qualitative data analysis. And so this is a very common way of doing comparison, but that's probably not the one that I want to talk about as much. The other one is what we call shadow comparisons, and it's a bit of a reaction to the grounded theory dominance in ethnography. And this is basically the notion that when you're doing ethnography, you're going to compare your own research to your predecessors and peers in related fields. And you're going to look for similarities and differences, and they're going to be analytically stimulating, and they're going to be reference points and comparative benchmarks for your own writing, which is, as you know, less emphasized in grounded theory, but it's definitely an accepted practice in contemporary ethnography. And the question then is, like, how can you maximize this kind of shadow comparisons? And Michael Garraway has written beautifully about the ethnographic revisit. Diane Vaughn has been, the way I read her, she uses her own work as a benchmark for comparison to her next project. And so there is, through the corpus of studies, there is a set of sort of shadow comparisons that is built into a project. But the topic we want to talk more about is the issue of external comparisons. So this is the idea that you make an explicit comparison between different sites and different populations. And so why would you go about doing this? Well, one of the common reasons of doing this is that you want to refine causal arguments. And our impression is, reading the literature, that ethnographers don't really have a strong track record of making strong causal arguments. Like the one study that stands as a beacon of light in this regard is Kate Kellogg's work on challenging operations in 3 hospitals that were very similar. But it's kind of a unique study because the sites were so similar of each other, and then they varied on only a couple of indicators that she then could develop analytically. The more common way of doing a comparison is as a theoretical provocation. It shows you what is salient in your own sites, and that's, I think, the more common reason to embark on this. But as I mentioned, that often fails. It doesn't pan out because the sites end up not being similar, end up either being too similar or not similar enough that is not a common ground for comparison. And part of the reason we think is that much of these comparisons are decided at the proposal stage, at the early design stage of a research project. And that sets you back in terms of developing a comparative project, because you're basically making a very strong bet based on the literature, based on what you hope to find, that the comparison is going to be salient. So what we developed in this book chapter is the idea of sequential comparisons, which we draw and borrow heavily from Mario Smal's exquisite writing on sampling, where he introduced the idea of sequential interviewing. You sample interviews by first exploring one group of interviewees and then going to a second group and a third group based on theoretical grounds. And so we would want to apply the same kind of principle to comparative ethnographies. So our recommendation for ethnographers thinking of a comparative ethnographic project would be to start in one site, explore that, develop that, spend a lot of time there, and then if you feel strongly that there is something analytically that is going to remain underexplored, is going to remain on the table, if you don't make a comparison, then you decide to go to a different site or a different population or a different set of cases. And so the bar is really high here. There needs to be a theoretical trigger that justifies this kind of a choice for a comparative site. So you need to have a strong need based on your insights gained in your first site that contrasting material is going to allow you to flesh something out analytically. And so the advantage of this sequential comparative ethnography would be that you base the comparison sort of on a halfway point in your study, and that the bar for embarking on the comparison would be, as I said, high and based on insights and literature.
Okay.
Let me just wrap this up by saying that there's, of course, one drawback to it, and this is that time is not your friend because you're doing it sequentially, but we believe that this sequential comparative ethnography has higher chances of providing interesting insights than studying 2 sites at the same time. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Stefan. Next, we turn to Annette Laurel, who is professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Annette?
Great, thank you. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a little slideshow here, which I'm starting. I'm loading it here. Let's see if you can all see this. And let me begin the slideshow. Okay, great. So I want to talk about design and the challenges of design and the various elements of it, and particularly the importance of dreaming, but also the chaotic and emergent character of fieldwork. And I have a book coming out with the University of Chicago Press, which this draws from. And I think we don't often think enough about the issue of dreaming and daydreaming, about what do you love, what kind of studies do you admire, what do you find satisfying, and also what studies do you want to not be like. And I think there that by definition, if you're doing something new, then nobody's done it before. And people can be skeptical. When I was doing the work for Unequal Childhoods, some people flat out told me it could not be done, but they were wrong because it could be done. And other people have had that experience as well. And so I wouldn't just try once or twice. I also wouldn't try 20 times, but I would try 3, 4, or 5 times to see if you can make it happen. But this gauzy, dreamy, all things are possible goals, the wonderful studies we have in our imaginations, very quickly comes into cold, harsh reality. And a lot of it's involved with how much time do you have, when do you need to be done, what are your highest priorities? For ethnography, as other people have spoken, you really need time to be there. And you need to build relationships, because in any intimate relationship, the relationship is different at the beginning than as it's deeper. And of course, as I show on the slide, just 2.5 hours of field work can multiply very quickly, and thus it creates a lot of time to do the work. But in trying to make hard decisions, we are often harshly criticized for small studies that have one class or one race, but really small is good. And although wrenching, I think we really want to limit the number of comparisons, and so that we can be thoughtful and as much as possible systematic about the comparisons. I tend to admire dissertations that are 9 months of field work with 30 interviews, or sometimes 2 6-month bouts in a community. And I think it depends. I mean, obviously you want to be there until you have saturation, until you really feel like you know what's going on and you're not learning new things. But I think you have to make hard choices. And I think there's been a little bit of an arms race, and we want to reset the clock a bit. But as you make these very hard decisions, obviously, I think you want to think a little bit about what are your conceptual contribution. I'm a Berkeley graduate. What's your critique? What's the so what? Who are your people in terms of who's the literature that you're trying to address? And so really confusion reigns in this process, where often you really have no idea what you're doing, and this is appropriate, but it's quite challenging. And it's also challenging because at different crucial milestones, we all need to perform competence. So if you have a dissertation proposal or a grant proposal, you have to act like you know what you're doing, and you have to show a form of clarity, which you really rarely have. And so I think you should just act like you know what you're doing and show, it's going to be great. I'm going to learn this, I'm going to learn that. But really then also understand that the chaos is not about you, but just a normal part of the process. And so the key issue here to me is that the process is emergent. And so that means there are routinely changes in your data collection process. You think, you focus, you adjust, you repeat the process. The research is emergent. And so, for example, right now I'm doing an interview study with people who are very wealthy. Mostly they have more than $10 million. I've been doing this for a while, partly because access is very challenging. But that means as it's going along and I'm sort of gradually figuring out what I'm doing, it means that I didn't ask questions to some of the first people I interviewed that I need to know now. So that means I'm going to have a data set that has holes in it. Similarly, sometimes you do field work and you don't look to take notes on what really in retrospect turns out to be a key question. Is this difficult? Yes. Can you avoid it? No. So I think we also need a more realistic account of field work, which takes by definition the chaotic, emergent, iterative process of collecting data, thinking, what's the big picture? What's my contribution? Why are we doing this? What do we hope to learn? And so I think we have many excellent ethnographers coming out. Every day I read an ethnography I admire. Trapped in the Maze by Leslie Payak is coming out from University of California Press. I think it's a terrific book. And I think small is good, but that means you have to do hard choices. I'm writing a book with an advanced graduate student, Blair Sackett, on really 4 or refugee families from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We have 40 interviews with other refugees who have come and 20 volunteers, but it's small. And we're going to get beat up a little bit in the literature, but I think that's the way it has to be. And then finally, as Mitch Denier once pointed out, it's really the dissertations which are leading the way in terms of ethnographic work. Often some of the best ethnographies were done by young scholars. It's very rare for senior scholars to do a second or third ethnography in a lifetime. And yet it's often junior scholars who are feeling most vulnerable, most unsure, most under-supported. And so, of course, writing groups are helpful, getting feedback is helpful. In the book, I talk about listening to what you're learning, listening to the feedback you're getting, listening to yourself to figure out what's most important. And so you're listening in multiple ways, but social support and feedback are crucial. But young people have crucial advantages. They often have more time to research than senior faculty. They often have original and fresh takes on the research and the questions, and they often have fire in the belly. And so many of I look forward to reading an excellent ethnography every day. And for those of you who are junior scholars who are on your research journey, I wish you well on that research process. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Annette. Next up, we have Thomas de Gloom, who's an associate professor of sociology at Hunter College in the Graduate Center at CUNY, and Max Papadontonakis, who's a PhD candidate in sociology at the Graduate Center at City University of New York.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I am very happy to be here, but before I delve into the substance of our talk, I want to share the same caveat that I shared with Corey and Neil when they initially asked me to write a chapter for their wonderful project on comparative ethnography, and that is I am definitely not an ethnographer. Fortunately, you will hear from my co-author shortly, and he is an ethnographer, so we do have a claim to legitimacy. But first, I will outline the main argument of our paper, which provides a framework for comparative ethnographic analysis, one that presents both opportunities and challenges for ethnographic research. Most basically, our paper is about how to focus on generalizable themes rather than on unique nuances when analyzing particular cases, how to identify what exactly is generalizable about a given case or observation, and then how to build a comparative set around your theme that includes various otherwise different cases, representing various social spheres, contexts, historical periods, and levels of analysis. This vision, really a mode of analysis, is what we call the thematic lens. And we're expanding on a conversation rooted in the formal sociology of Georg Simmel and developed by various others, including Glaser and Strauss, Evyatar Zerubbabel, Robert Proust, David Snow, and Diane Vaughn. In our discussion, we've combined attention to the dynamic foundations of symbolic social interaction and emergent meaning on the one hand, and the ways that actors draw on durable and historically relevant codes, symbolism, and scripted text, the rich elements of culture and deep-seated structures of symbolic communication on the other hand, to illustrate how a thematic lens might guide a comparative ethnography. In my own work, I used this approach to write about the general theme of awakenings, significant personal discoveries and self-transformations, which initially grew from my research focused on recovered memories of childhood sexual abuse. As I was initially focused on this single case, I began to notice that the process of recovering memories involved a formulaic discovery of truth, in this case, the memory of abuse, and a consequent formulaic account of the narrator's false belief, their prior mistaken perception that the abuse wasn't there. Many self-identified survivors of childhood sexual abuse tell scripted stories about awakening to the truth in their lives. I then noticed that those who dispute claims of recovered memories promote the stories of retractors, those who redefine their once recovered memories to be false memories. Despite being oppositional, retractor stories actually follow the same pattern and rely on the very same underlying cultural and emotion codes. Furthermore, such stories are formally similar to a variety of political, religious, sexual, psychological, scientific, and philosophical stories from various times and places. By focusing on the formal properties shared by these stories at the expense of their otherwise significant differences, I began to see the general social logic of the story formula. As opposed to treating any one case or substantive domain as the primary or bounded focus of study, the thematic character of the story plot became my primary analytic lens, yielding insight that would not necessarily be possible with a single case study. In my current work, I'm also applying a thematic lens to develop a cultural pragmatics of anonymity as my guiding theme. Consider, for example, that social movements like the EZLN or Zapatista Army of National Liberation and the Ku Klux Klan have radically different, even oppositional political ideologies and agendas. These particular movements are rooted in different national contexts and span different periods of time. Their respective participants have different cultural backgrounds and most likely speak different languages. Yet, despite these very significant differences, both groups use anonymity to subvert their normative social and political orders in ways that share important characteristics. Both perform their political activities behind masks, and like modern hacktivists and Occupy organizers who operate behind the image of Guy Fawkes, their masks have become symbolic icons of their political activities. Such divergent groups and networks use their masks to evoke some ideologically infused scene, story, or political disposition associated with the past. Moreover, while using different symbols and pursuing different objectives, all of these subversive agents use anonymity to depreciate the individualistic ego and accentuate the mass collective character of their oppositional standpoints. As this brief example shows, a sociology of subversive anonymity will look much different than a sociology of the EZLN, the KKK, the Hacker Network Anonymous, or any other particular social movement or organization. Using such a thematic lens allows scholars who study single cases to transcend the conventionally circumscribed character of their analytic concerns, as Max has also considered in his work. Max?
Thanks, Tom. Working on this paper with Professor de Gloma, I had the opportunity as an ethnographer with an interest in symbolic interactionism to explore how we can uncover generic social processes in very specific cases. So in the style of Robert Pruse's work, for example, I was inspired by the back and forth process between field research, analyzing ethnohistorical materials, and thinking about broader theories. The empirical work I carried out for this chapter, which I also analyzed in a journal article published by the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, titled Black Athenians, looks at how gestures like handshakes reproduce racialized stigmatization. Although my research took place in the context of the modern Greek street market, the structure of the interactional dynamics I observed may apply to cases beyond the Greek street market. I have not pursued such research more concretely, but Professor de Gloma and I have theorized and written about different cases in which people might interpret certain gestures as signs of stigmatized characteristics. For example, the imputation of sexuality via the interpretation of gesture, police officers interpreting some gestures or bodies as indicative of criminality, and psychological practitioners interpreting the gestures and body language of their clients as indicative of pathology. Such structures of classification, although pertaining to starkly different processes, underlie such interactive dynamics. Actors mobilize these interpretative cultural structures in their specific situated interactions to create or reproduce meaningful distinctions and inequalities. So the strength of using a thematic lens lies in the fact that it requires us to highlight the relevance of recurrent social forms, including patterned interactive dynamics, narrative structures, as well as cultural codes that are fundamental to our meaning-making enterprises. These are structural generalities that would not only otherwise be less clear, but also help us to shed light on our particular cases, giving us insight that we would otherwise lack. Moreover, such an approach allows us to see how patterns transcend micro, meso, and macro dimensions of interaction culture, helping us to understand the relationship between these dimensions at different levels of analyses. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thanks, Thomas and Max. And then finally for this panel, we'll have Claire Descoteaux, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Claire.
Hi, sorry. Okay, here we go. So I just wanted to start by thanking Neil and Corey, and also to say that I'm excited to join my colleagues today for this important conversation. Unlike some of my other panelists, instead of sort of a general talk about a particular kind of comparative method, I'm actually going to use my particular case to illustrate a method that I used. So I'll begin my short presentation by explaining the comparative case on which this chapter was based. From 2012 to 2016, I conducted ethnographic research with Somali parents whose children were diagnosed with autism in Minneapolis and Toronto. Oops. Several international research studies have confirmed that Somali migrants living in North America and European countries have high rates of more disabling forms of autism. In my work, I sought to understand how Somalis' experiences of migration and marginalization figure into their meaning-making of autism, but I also sought to compare the epistemic communities that they've formed in each location. So the guiding question that this chapter sought to answer was, what makes the same population, Somali immigrants, exposed to the same puzzling phenomena, high rates of autism, forge different explanations, target different authority figures for blame, and join divergent health movements with varying degrees of success? I suggest that combining insight from extended case method and critical realism offers an interesting way to answer this question. First, I take up George Steinmetz's call to compare small n cases across both the event and the structural mechanism. Drawing on insights from critical realism, Steinmetz argues that because structural mechanisms can be analytically separated from the events to which they give rise, we can compare across both empirical level events and across generative structural mechanisms. In my case, the event in question is the forging of epistemic communities by Somali immigrants to make sense of the high rates of autism in their communities. Certain features of the Somali autism experience hold constant across the two national contexts. For example, all the Somalis that I interviewed suggested that autism was a Western disease, which did not exist in Somalia and was therefore not genetic in origin. Rather, they argued, autism is caused by a set of environmental and social conditions that are unique to life in Western countries, including the use of preservatives, genetically modified processing, and antibiotics in both health and food production, environmental toxicity, aggressive vaccine schedules, and racial bias in the diagnosis and treatment of autism. Somalis in both locations forged epistemic communities to make sense of this unique vulnerability. Somalis in both locations, Somali parents of children with autism in both locations forged support groups, which became locations to form these epistemic communities that were united around a unique causal theory for autism that both signified their journey as refugees and racially marginalized others, but also contested mainstream theories of autism. Because autism exists in a contested scientific field, epistemic communities allow members to shore up the symbolic capital necessary to mobilize for resources and challenge mainstream categories and explanations. These communities are epistemic because they allow Somalis to adjudicate truth claims and to forge alliances with expert groups. Epistemic communities are heterodox in nature, and they provide their members with epistemic, political, and therapeutic strategies for action. The meanings that Somalis make of autism have ontological ramifications for how autism is embodied by their children. So these epistemic communities are formed in both locations, and that is the way in which there's sort of this similarity across the level of the event. But when we go to the level of the generative structural mechanism, we recognize that they also shift and change over time and have varying degrees of success and impact. So many of the structural features that inform group formation between the two national sites, including racial formations, refugee policies, autism health policies, response to vaccine hesitancy, and the involvement of local public health, education, and medical communities are different in these two sites. And these different structural contexts have influenced the content, composition, coherence, and political impact of the Somali autism communities over time. So one primary puzzle that I needed to unravel in this research is that Minneapolis Somali community has garnered tremendous political and economic attention from local, state, and even national autism advocates and experts. Somalis are employed by local public health, education, and healthcare institutions. There was a CDC study focusing specifically on prevalence rates among Somalis in Minneapolis, and Somalis were integral to changing existing treatment programs in the entire state. The Toronto Somali community has largely been ignored by government at all levels. And though they have used similar social movement strategies, their political impact has been very minimal. So I argue that the reasons for this concern primarily three mechanisms and their conjunctural interrelationship. Vaccine hesitancy, the mandate of local public health experts, and accusations of racial inequality. Because of beliefs about the MMR vaccine causing autism, there have been measles outbreaks concentrated in the Somali community in Minneapolis. This drew the attention of public health advocates who work closely with the Somali community, which has also caused a lot of tension and splits within the community. But Somalis in Minneapolis successfully used accusations of racial disparities against existing government officials, which resulted in greater political attention and resources. So it was these three things operating together. These conditions do not exist in Canada, where accusations of racial disparity are harder to prove due to lack of attention to racial difference, particularly in data collection. And in this case, the racial bias that Somalis were experiencing was less overt. And even though Somalis in Canada are also vaccine hesitant, there have been no measles outbreaks in their communities. So this illustrates that there were a series of structural mechanisms operating together in a conjunctural and contingent fashion to influence the success and political power of each epistemic community in the two locations. And yet it's important to note that Somalis played a key role in making these structural dynamics operative. In other words, the mechanism didn't simply operate on Somalis. Rather, they manipulated and strategically engaged with these structural features to influence particular outcomes. Critical realists often fail to highlight the mutual constitution of agents and structures. But in this case, agents were strategic in utilizing the conjuncture of structures in which they were operating to not only navigate their social world, but to intervene in it, thereby shifting the content and force of those structures moving forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Claire. So that was the last speaker for this panel. So if everyone from the panel can turn their video on again, it should move to gallery view. So thanks to the presenters. People who are in the audience, feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask questions. And then I'm going to invite Lisa Minchin, who's a PhD student in sociology at University of Arizona, to ask the first question and take over Q&A.
So this first question is for Martin Sanchez-Jankowski, and it is, you have continued doing participant observation throughout your career. Have you noticed differences between researching as an older person compared to when you were younger?
The answer is I have, and there are some things I have, and then some things that I have not. The first I would say is that like anybody who's a researcher, and all the people who have probably spoken to you on this session, whenever you start off a research project, it is always awkward. You are always the odd person in a group, and it takes some time. So for that, nothing has changed over time. It does matter, and in terms of what you look like and who you are. And so sometimes, for example, I studied gangs early, and I was young, and I could mix with them, and I didn't look much different than them because there was a great, age range as well. I could not do that now, so that is something that one has to actually take into consideration when they're going to study something, because you do have to, in some ways, blend to some extent. I'm engaged in a 10-year study at the moment that's funded by the World Bank on indigenous people in two groups of people in the United States, one in Fiji and one in India. And there I would just tell you that my age in terms of blending is not a issue. Of course, stamina is always an issue. I think Annette, has indicated that something about that, about being young and not being young. But is it possible? Yes, I've done it, and where I'm doing it now in heavy jungle terrain in both Fiji and living in a hammock for at least the minimum of a month and a half to 2 months at a time is taxing, but it's still doable. So the answer is yes, some things are different as you age, and some things are the same. But I would say that as you age, like anything else, and I would emphasize this to young people, borrowing on Annette's ideas, and that is you get better at what you do the more you do it. And that's because you make mistakes and you correct for them the second time around, and third time and fourth time.
Thank you. And this next question is for Stefan Timmermans and Ido Tavri. And it is, would sequential comparison allow charting the differential impact of historical events like COVID-19? What would it provide over simultaneous comparison?
That's a really good question. And I think one of the challenges for ethnographers during COVID-19 is actually to do ethnography in COVID-19. I think it's actually more a time period that is primed for doing interviews, for doing in-depth interviews. People are bored out of their mind and very happy to chat with you via Zoom or Skype or phone calls. So I'm not sure that this time period actually plays to the strength of ethnography. I think it plays much more to the strength of doing interviews. And then in terms of sequentially interviewing, so the thing about COVID-19, it's a good question in the sense that it shows the highlights a little bit of the challenges of doing this sequential process, because COVID-19 is moving so incredibly rapidly. We are now in California in the second surge, and it's very different from like 2 weeks ago. It's very different kind of from 4 weeks ago, and so the timing of the interviews is going to be really critical. And so this might be a situation where it would make more sense to decide on two groups to interview and interview them simultaneously rather than sequentially.
I would only add to this that I think when you have these kind of very rapidly moving events, in most cases in any ethnography, I mean, again, COVID has its own challenges, but if we're thinking just about rapidly moving events, unless you decide you're going to do like Mondays and Wednesdays in one site and Tuesdays and Thursdays in another, which, is possible, but you don't get very deep in either when you do it that way because you don't kind of dive into them. It becomes very, very hard to do multi-sited work within a very short period of time. Not that it's impossible, but I just think, again, that's not the strength of ethnography. And I think this is where the shadow comparisons are really important. I mean, we work with a community of scholars. Our work is part of a larger conversation. So focusing is actually, I think, especially in rapidly moving events, I would say just work with work in one place.
Could I add a counterpoint to that one? So I think this actually highlights one of the really interesting issues with comparison, because any model, sequential, simultaneous, is going to have strengths and drawbacks. And COVID-19 does present a really unique challenge in that fieldwork is largely impossible. But I disagree with the idea that studying places on Monday and Tuesday and then others on Wednesday and Thursday creates an issue. It only creates an issue if ethnography is seen as a fast method. And what separates ethnography from other methods, in addition to being closer to people, is that it is horribly inefficient and it takes a tremendous amount of time. So in my case, in my first book, there was a historical event, right? We talk about these as ruptures in cultural sociology, things that sort of change the status quo and allow social reconfigurations. And in that case, it didn't involve, a novel coronavirus, but was rather the austerity measures of the Great Recession. And for me, like Martine, the key point is to understand proceeds so that we could develop interventions, not theory. We use theory, we contribute to theory, we speak to the relative plausibility of one explanation or another. But, and I've had this conversation with Stefan, so he's heard this one before. But if I had only done the poor neighborhoods first and then done the rich neighborhoods, as opposed to doing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but also Friday, Saturday, because I too was younger, then I wouldn't be able to track the differential impact across those places. So austerity measures did not affect middle class areas, maybe not surprising, the same way that they did poor areas. They each had their own adaptive responses. And the way in which that played out was really important to understanding how particular mechanisms of inequality, such as structural differences, social networks, meanings, motivations, cultural strategies, et cetera, were differentially deployed to differential impacts. So, but I would say to anybody that's considering doing that, you can't do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, because some things are time variant. So I was doing a pilot project in CrossFit gyms, again, when I was younger, and what I found is they're very different cliques. So if one generalizes from the AM class, which tends to be younger, at least in the gyms that I was at, then you get what is essentially using the terms of, I guess, post-positivist realism, a skewed sample not of people, but of interactions, which is our unit of analysis. So that it's always a tricky thing, but I think often people write off simultaneous comparison in part because there isn't a well-defined question. And then people say, but how do you define a question? You pick a problem that needs solving. And that's how it is. I mean, it's a core principle of some approaches to pragmatism. Inequality at the end of life, not necessarily the sexiest topic, relative to younger people or other things. However, it's one that needed to be written on, and that's one way to select those comparisons. Not the only way, but it's one way.
Thank you. This next question is for Annette Leroux. How and in what ways can ethnography contribute to social change in addressing critical social problems? What are its possibilities and what are its limitations in this regard?
Well, I think that's a great question. I mean, I do think that from other research, we know that people remember stories, and stories can move the heart as well as the mind. And thus, in some ways, ethnography is a very powerful form of helping a broad audience think about a problem in new ways. And so I think the direct impact on policy, I think that's an indirect method. But I think by helping to broaden people's perspectives and give them alternative ways to think about it, that can be quite helpful and valuable. I think it's harder because to have a direct impact on, it sort of depends what policy, what level, are you talking local, state, federal, et cetera, who are the key people? But sometimes people work and go to legislative hearings or talk, and we've seen a lot of people doing that. I think now, for example, with the vaccine research, you see people like Jennifer Reich having really important role to say because she knows something about vaccines, and so I think it's highly variable. But I think it's not the same as direct social protest or social change. I don't think we should kid ourselves to think that, but I do think it can have an important impact over time.
Can I interject actually at this time?
Yes.
Let me just say from my own perspective, probably not going to say a lot of things that's different than Annette, but I will say something that is substantially different for those people. Policy changes take place at two levels. One can be at the street level in terms of protests, social movements, etc. We all know about that. And that's sort of made some, suggestions about that in relationship to ethnography. But I will tell you from my own personal experiences, you can actually have an impact on your research in various areas of public policy that does have an impact. And I personally have been a consultant, an ongoing consultant at the federal level on gangs as we speak, and on national security related to gangs as we speak at the federal level. I've also been at the local level and being somebody who has developed the anti-gang programs in both Salinas, California and San Jose, California, been the architect of those. So the question really is, can you do this stuff? Yes. I tried to say something in my remarks. It depends on how you do it and what you say and whether you really kind of want to do it. It isn't that every approach in ethnography can do this or wants to do this, but if you do want to do it, it is possible, but it has to be done in a certain kind of way so that they allow you they see that what you've observed, because they haven't observed it, can be utilized in development of policy. So it is possible. And remember, social change does happen through policies. And the best example I can give you is the national effort on gangs had been to begin with on a weed and seed program, and that came out of various sorts of ethnographic studies, but mostly, which I was involved in.
Thank you. This question is for Max Papadantonakis and Thomas DeGloma. How can your approach leverage or deconstruct seeming similarity to make thematic generalizations?
Can you repeat that? How can your approach leverage or deconstruct seeming similarity to make theoretical generalizations?
Generalizations.
Okay. So is that just I'm going to take that as a general question of how the process works. And Max, do you want to start or do you want me to?
You go ahead, Tom. I have to think about this a little bit.
Okay. Well, I think that there is a little bit of an abductive approach to take from Stefan and Ido here in the sense that when looking at a single case, there's a constant interplay between analysis and then going back to the case or the data, and then at further analysis, and then at some point thinking about other cases or other data that might actually provide a good comparative example of a specific process or a specific phenomena that you've observed. So, for example, I'll just speak about Max's work if he doesn't mind, because I'm very familiar with his article, and I encourage you all to read his article in the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography. Is that, we spent a lot of time talking about what he observed, where local Greek vendors were interpreting the fact that immigrants would shake hands and hold one another's hands for a few seconds longer than was typical in Greece. And they would interpret that as a way of, sort of aggressively ascribing homosexuality to the immigrants and using that to discriminate against immigrants. And so this interpretation of gesture then became a theme. It became something that Max started thinking about. He started thinking about, what does that mean to ascribe some sort of pathological characteristic or to discriminate on somebody based on some sort of symbolic reinterpretation of gesture? And does that occur in other contexts? And then there's a leap there that goes, sort of in an inductive way, but it's a generalizable way that involves looking for the form of that question, the basic foundation, the basic structure involved with the process you've observed, minus all of its unique nuances, and saying, does this occur in other places where split-second determinations based on an interpretation of gesture are used to put somebody in a pathological or discriminated against category? And then that becomes a process of selecting these other cases. But you then have to go back and analyze the cases. It's not just that you pick cases and sort of say that they match when they don't. I think there's a trade-off, and this is where I might differ just a little bit with my advisor and mentor, Evyatar Zarubaville, between focusing in on these generalities, but also committing to do the type of in-depth interpretation of each case that's at least enough to be able to show the relevance of each case to the process that you're focused on. But at that point, should Max decide to take on the project, his project would no longer be about a Greek street market. It would be about the imputation of deviance or pathology via gesture. And it would become something that was a project on that broader thematic level. And I hope I did justice to your work, Max, because I love the article and I just thought it was a good example.
Thank you. I couldn't have said this better myself, but you covered me. Thank you.
Thank you. And this next question is for Claire Decoteau. A perennial challenge for ethnographers is figuring out the boundaries of the community being studied. In your study, it seems like you focused on parents of children with autism. Did you also research Somali immigrants whose children did not have autism or other parents with autism who are not Somali immigrants? And how did you make these decisions about the focus of your project?
Thank you. I did only do interviews and ethnographic observation with Somali parents of children with autism. But I did do interviews as well with a whole host of folks involved in kind of policy development and educational provision, because in part of the project was also to look at how kind of situating the story of autism from the perspective of Somali immigrants really shifts our gaze towards racial disparities that exist within the sort of health infrastructure that they were navigating. So in addition to sort of doing the ethnographic work with the Somali parents themselves, I did sort of a larger project that kind of looked at the system that they were navigating and what their case sort of exposed about that system. As well as sort of scientific research on autism as well. So to me, the gaze was sort of through them to see how it was that an experience of folks who are racially and nationally and religiously marginalized, shows us something new about autism, both in terms of meaning making, but also in terms of kind of the broader kind of health infrastructure. But I actually, that's a good, I wanted to kind of jump in on the question about how ethnography can sort of matter for social change or for policy, because I think it's actually hugely important, because I think that doing ethnography really exposes complexities that people who design policy have no idea are happening on the ground. So for example, in my work on HIV in South Africa, I really found that people were trying to take antiretrovirals according to kind of the health policy's mandates, but they were suffering from, food shortages and lack of financial, well-being and all of these other vulnerabilities that were getting in the way, in addition to having indigenous forms of knowledge and belief systems. And all of that was kind of getting in the way of like the best practices. But if you don't actually talk to people on the ground, then you don't have any idea as policymakers that these kinds of complexities are happening. And we're doing research right now with people who are socially vulnerable under COVID, and we're finding the same thing, that the policies that are being put in place to mitigate, COVID infections, even those that are attempting to pay attention to racial disparities, are totally missing the mark, because the vulnerabilities that people are experiencing are so vast and complicated. And there's all kinds of holes that the policymakers are kind of missing. So I think that ethnography offers us a really important lens for suggesting social change, because it allows us to really excavate all of those intricacies and complications that people sort of from on high aren't really aware of because they're not living it.
Thank you. And we have two questions now for Neil Gong. One from Simon Gottschalk, which is, how does conducting ethnography online require us to rethink our approaches, methods, and criteria? And from someone else who's asking, on the note of COVID, how do you feel about digital ethnography? This is still underdeveloped in sociology and has experienced serious skepticism within the field. I'm wondering about the future of doing ethnography online.
Elise, did you say those were directed at me? I'm not sure I actually have particularly useful thoughts. If anyone wants to jump in, who's been thinking about this more, please feel free.
I'll just, if I can, mention very quickly that I've always been interested in public claims and public acts and from a cultural, sociological, and a performance theory perspective, and how meaning is done publicly. And I think that there are vibrant online communities that can be great data and great cases from that perspective. There are open public forums of people. Just to list one example of many that I've looked at, there are vibrant communities of ex-Mormons online who gather online and talk about leaving their faith, and they have back and forth conversations. There's all kinds of rich, symbolic, culturally relevant data, not just in the text itself, but in their choice of screen names and avatars and the content of their conversations. And in some cases, these communities wouldn't be able to form otherwise. There's a growing community of people who identify as survivors of reparative therapy, who once went through therapy to cure them of their homosexuality and later have embraced being homosexual and found one another online. They call themselves the Beyond Ex-Gay community. And they sort of cohere online, but have actually conferences in the real world as well. So I think that there is, just like the mantra that your methods should fit your question, if those communities serve to give you the insight that you're looking for, I think absolutely you should do that unapologetically and make your case very strongly and vocally.
Thank you.
Sorry, Corey, do you want to go?
Yeah, this is actually a quick one from me. I was just going to say, I recently did a piece with Gary Allen Fine talking about this, and there really are lots of important online settings. So I feel okay with digital ethnography, pluralist. However, I do think there's a push towards false equivalences between observing behavior in situ, not online, and behavior that is online. Not that one's better, but they're different.
I agree with Corey, which is good. And just say that I think one thing that is, I think when you look situationally, online communities are incredibly important. And I think there's some research, often, young people will go out, and the going out is only the staging ground for the stuff they're going to put online later on, right? And if you're not understanding what's going on online, you're just not understanding anything that's going on there. And I think also just things that are simply online are incredibly important. One of the problems is, one is the issue of presence, but another is the issue of people over different platforms. And I think that presents a challenge, which makes it very good to look at specific kinds of situations, specific kinds of contracted situations, but makes it a little bit harder to follow people in specific ways. So I think it's incredibly important to study online interaction. The question of, whether it's online ethnography, whether it's, that's in some sense, it's a question both of nomenclature, but kind of claims making, which I don't know how important that is for us.
Thank you. This next question is from Anya Goodman, who is a biochemist interested in shifting focus from molecules to humans. And Anya is asking, Dr. Leroux mentioned anticipated pushback on low-end in ethnographic studies. Do ethnographers use surveys or something else to follow up on themes from observations and interviews? Is that a valid way to approach ethnographic studies, or is that completely out of the question?
Well, I'll just say that I think we all have to make hard choices. And the thing that troubles me about this effort to make one study do everything, such as have interviews of 3 figures, over 100 interviews, do, multiple sites. And, when I wrote my book, Unequal Childhoods, is, in my opinion, overly ambitious. I had 12 families when really 1 or 2 would have been fine. I had a large grant. I had research assistants helping me every day, and it was still overly ambitious. And in the end, why collect data and then throw it away? So the issue with surveys is surveys often collect very different data, which have very different interpretations. Often it's fixed response categories. It's not focused on meaning. It's focused on surveys. And so generally, just speaking for myself, if I'm going to spend a lot of time and energy writing a study, I'd rather, and often it's a different skill set realistically, to analyze ethnographic data and quantitative data. Quantitative data, they're very concerned about if you have a linear distribution, et cetera. So you just need a lot of informal knowledge. So I can't tell you the number of people and the millions of dollars that have been spent collecting quote unquote mixed method data. And there are just not a lot of publications, in my opinion, to support truly excellent work where we've seen widely cited work with mixed methods. So I think if I had a nickel for everyone who told me they wanted to do mixed methods, great. But I don't think we see a long line of publications in sociology to support the claim that that's really going to make an important contribution to the field.
Thank you. This next question is from Michael Gibson Light for Martin Sanchez Jankowski. One thing we don't often see frequently in sociology is comparisons across time rather than across cases or sites. What do you see as the values or limitations of comparing observations at the same site after long periods of time, which Burraway refers to as focused revisits?
Martine, you're muted.
I think there are two types of things under the Burraway's notion of the revisit. I think the Burraway's notion of the revisit, for the most part, is a substitute for replication. So I don't think it's the exact same thing as doing something sequentially that in terms of over a long period of time. Now, in my study of, I have done things both in terms of, I've done lots of studies that are over long periods of time. And in Europe, one's approach, I would like to say to you, can be one of two different natures. One, if the research question is one in which does time really matter? Is there something that's the same between time 1 and time 20? That's something that is very important, and we'd want to know that. That is, that time doesn't really have an effect on what we've observed. On the other issue where I have looked at what social change matters, then the idea about social change is that you're going to spend a lot of time in these areas, and you're really tracking what changes occur and why they occur in everyday behavior. What are the actual variables that enter those people's lives that actually made a difference, not just for the individuals, but as sociologists, as the groups matter. And that really is terribly important. So I guess what I'm saying, and I want to become very clear, is it really kind of depends. When you do the comparative mode like this, it allows you to do one of two things that you want to focus on your study. What has not changed over time, which is one of the things I found among gangs, which has actually been replicated a number of times and found to be, so substantiated. And the other is when you're really focused in on how social change occurs. And I did this with neighborhoods, and I'm now doing this with indigenous people in the various parts of the world, where I really am concerned about where issues of what factors change their daily lives and the construction of their societies or their elements.
Thank you. This question from Melanie Jesk for Claire Ducot, Stefan Timmermans, and Diane Vaughn. As sociologists who study scientific organizations and knowledge production, as many scientific activities become less place-based, as either virtual engagements, networks of teams across states and countries, etc., how do you think about ethnography in these spaces, where observations of the everyday mundane practices and decision-making processes that can be so illuminating are hidden from view? Would anyone like to tackle that question first?
I'm going to talk about that in my presentation. So why don't I let someone else answer it now? But the short answer is, it is possible to study one system or one organization or socio-technical system. And you can define that as being a small group, an organization, or a larger socio-technical system.
I would say that, I mean, I think that there are often interesting ways of sort of combining different methods in these kinds of situations. So sometimes, for example, I have a project on the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, which is a federal committee where they actually hold their meetings largely in sort of virtual space, and everything is documented, and so the archives are all available. And so you actually do get a lot of the play. I mean, you're not actually physically there, but actually many of the people are not either. So you still get a lot of the contention and the, you know, I don't know, a lot of the politics, a lot of the disagreements, a lot of the contention all emerges in those archives. So if you can couple that with interviews, or if there is a place to actually go and observe. In addition to that, I sometimes find in those kinds of situations that doing multiple kinds of methods in this pluralist way that Corey is embracing is sometimes really helpful for uncovering all of those nuances and complexities that you may not be able to do, or that just really don't exist in those kinds of situations, because there isn't as much kind of in-person meeting anyway.
I will add that, so I've just done an ethnography of an ad agency that I'm kind of writing, and that's a lot of it is teleconferencing and meeting, and so it's challenging. And you know, part of what you try to do is to try to insinuate yourself and sit with people as they're sitting on the conferences, as they're sitting on the computer. It's hard because people get very tired of you quite quickly, kind of literally looking over their shoulder as they're looking at their computers. You know, being an ethnographer is being somewhere, right? Unless we're talking about kind of virtual ethnography, which you're also somewhere, but maybe doesn't matter. But being somewhere, you know, has its challenges, but it also has its opportunities. Like, you know, you sit on these teleconferences and they're talking about some kind of some kind of new technology that the ad agency is trying to buy, and you know, the people kind of sound very seriously, but to each other they're like, right? And this is really an important part of what's going on. That's going on probably from both sides of that conversation simultaneously, but you're only seeing one side of it. But still, you know, being in a place creates its challenges, but also its opportunities, even in these cases as well.
Great.
Thank you. And it looks like we are out of time for questions.
So Neil is muted, and I think what he's probably trying to say, although I don't want to impute things, is that we have a really brief 5-minute break, and then we are going to come back and start off with Diane Vaughn. So bathroom/coffee break.
Everybody. For those of you who are just tuning in, we've just had a series of excellent talks from the first panel, discussing comparison from a variety of different ethnographic traditions. So most of the presenters today have contributed to the volume that we're discussing, Beyond the Case, The Logics and Practices of Comparative Ethnography, which came out this year with Oxford University Press. But we're also joined by a number of wonderful guests who are not involved in the volume. And as noted before, we hope this book contributes to a spirit of ethnographic pluralism and can serve as an entry point for those who are interested in doing comparative ethnography themselves. And so just to say a little bit more about the volume before moving into the next panel, we have representatives from, as I mentioned, this wide variety of traditions: positivism, the extended case method, symbolic interactionism, abductive approaches, critical realism, cognitive sociology, and others. And so part of the book takes inspiration, as mentioned before, from comparative historical methods. There's been a long reflections on comparative logic seen in interdisciplinary work across sociology, history, and political science. But then, of course, the book turns specifically to ethnography and field methods, engaging long-standing questions, debates about induction versus deduction versus abduction, issues around case selection, but through this particular lens of comparison, which often forces people in different traditions to sort of rethink some of these core questions. And then much of the analytical work Corey and I did was to try and then put these different contributions and perspectives in dialogue. Deborah, could you throw that image up if it is available? Thank you. So this is just a portion of some of the analytic work we did and putting it into this table where we tried to extract the logic of these different contributors. So we have here we have behavioralism, the extended case method, symbolic interaction, and I guess some of the other ones got cut off. But just so you get a sense of what we're trying to do here, so you have a part on why are people comparing, so different goals, practical and the how part, the practical and analytical approaches to setting up comparisons, the end products, and then some examples of works in these traditions. So just to consider this how portion, right? You can see these very different ideas here. So are you creating stratified samples of the population to understand the impact of, say, a particular variable? Others may be looking at looking at organizations in different structural locations, say across national borders. And then the third approach we have here is looking at very different objects that may have some similarities that transcend the differences, across the differences. And then our conclusion takes this table, tries to identify points of convergence, as well as parts where the logics end up being somewhat incommensurable, and pointing the way to the different utilities of these different approaches for different purposes. We have different debates, some of which we've already addressed, about when a comparison should be introduced, whether a priori in study design or whether emergently, debates about different kinds of generalizability. And then we also have, and we'll hear about some of this in the second panel, debates about the disciplinary reasons that people compare some things and not others, or study some things and not others, for creating an archive of comparison. For instance, why the United States in studies of inequality often focuses on poverty, but less focused on elite lifestyles. Now, if these debates seem useful to you, we hope you'll check out Beyond the Case, both for all of the wonderful contributions and then the sort of analytical synthetic work that Corey and I do, as you can see a little bit of in this table. So now we'll begin the next session, which Corey will moderate.
Unmute. Okay, great. I think this has been a really super interesting discussion, and we are going to kick the next session off with Diane Vaughn, who is professor of sociology at Columbia University.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here and be part of this great book, and sort of a book fest, actually. In contrast to the other approaches to ethnography that we've discussed, mine is more complementary to the sequential multi-site comparisons that Ido and Stefan discussed, but with three differences. One is following Zimmel, that I do cross-case rather than same-case comparison, looking for similarities and differences. Second, the cases selected can vary in levels of analysis. They just need to have the same research question or the same point of inquiry in the research question. And third, history matters, and it becomes part of the analysis of change over time. So my interest is in how the past materializes in the present. So this is what I would call historical ethnography. Now, historical ethnography has been done before in multiple varieties. And for what I'm going to bring out today is based on a new book called Dead Reckoning: System Effects, Boundary Work, and Risk in Air Traffic Control. And which is an historical, cross-case, comparative, multi-sided ethnography. So it's an exotic case, but I think some of the problems that it raises are issues common to any kind of a sequential multi-unit comparison. So how did I get interested? Why air traffic control? I had finished 3 books on how things go wrong in organizations, where I compared organizations that varied in size, complexity, and function. And they had one common pattern. And I chose air traffic control to be the negative case because here was a large-scale organizational technical system, also politically vulnerable, that managed to get things mostly right. So this was my negative case built into the first comparison. And my research questions were, what is it that makes the air traffic control system so safe? Or is it, given its political vulnerability? And the second question is, what is it that controllers do that technology can't replace? So my fieldwork was in 4 facilities in the New England region of the air traffic control system. And this included the tower at Boston Logan Airport, the middle range radar settler, also at Boston Airport, and the high altitude center, and then a small tower in Bedford, Massachusetts. And I visited them sequentially. And so the differences and similarities between them began to stand out over time as I moved from place to place. I was in the field for 15 months between 2000 and 2001. And the study at that time was ethnography, interviews, and I also had surveys to get background. I left the field in June of 2001, and on September 11th, 2 of the hijacked planes out of Logan Airport were handled by 3 of my air traffic control facilities. And at this point that it became an historical ethnography. I had seen evidence of the past having effect and the facilities when I was in there. So for example, controllers were working on 1960s technology, and some of them were not as old as the technology they were working on. But I knew from being there, I understood how the system worked and how controllers did an unprecedented feat in bringing down 14,000 airplanes. 4,000 airplanes in over 2 hours. And that I also knew that these capabilities had materialized historically as the system evolved to meet changing circumstances that were coming from actions and social actors in the external environment. And so the 2 problems that I think are also common, one is how you theorize a multi-sided comparison, and I had 4 facilities. And second, how do you organize the temporal dimensions of the field intervention into a book showing in my case, how the past manifests in the present, and what are the similarities and differences across time and social space. So the solution, the way I resolved it, is in contrast to other historical ethnographies, I situated the ethnography chapters in the history. So once I realized what I had and the historical content, I reconstructed the history of the system in order to show how it developed the characteristics that it had at the time that I entered the field. Now, I used archival data, not being an historical sociology. To do this, I followed my process that I had used for uncoupling, which is also a historical transition showing changes that happen over time. So ultimately, I divided this into 4 eras, and then I went to the historical sociology to see what I had and how it was similar and different to what they had. But by doing this, I had showed the larger context in which controllers work when I entered the facilities. And then in the chapters, at that point, there were 10 chapters, and 8 showed the similarities of controllers in their training, emotional effects, risk, various other things. And 2 of them were comparative. So it was like 2 little chapters in 1 chapter comparing two facilities, and they had each similar headings and some subheadings so that they could be compared. And so all four facilities were there. And then it showed really the differences in similarities in the system. And then by the time I had finished, they had automated. And since one of my questions was, what do controllers do that technology can't replace? I went back in 2017 to just two of the facilities. And what I saw was nothing like what I had seen before. It was a system in crisis. And again, history mattered. It was not just automation, but there was a staffing shortage, and both automation and the staffing shortage plans, the automation plans and staffing shortage began in the 90s. They were separate historical trajectories that intersected in the system in just this time. And one of the things that I was able to see was that controllers were engaged in repair. Now, I had known about this in the past, but it was the first chance that I had to be there and see how it was that controllers kept the system going. And this allowed me also to elaborate a number of the concepts that I had before, such as the liabilities of technological transformations, boundary work, ethnocognition, culture and cognition, and some of the other things. So the outcome, okay, so the outcome of this research is that it was comparative in three ways. I compared 4 facilities at the same time in the initial period of 2000-2001. And second, sequentially across 3 periods of field intervention, 2001, post-September 11th, and then 2017. And then I situate the field work between the system history and the system present, allowing multiple points of comparison over time. I would like to make one example because I haven't talked about anything empirical in the case in terms of the observations, but in terms of theorizing the multiple cases, something I heard, I was hanging out a lot. I was there about 10 hours a day, and I was in the facilities a long time. And several controllers had said to me separately and uninvited, you know, the stress of this job isn't in the airplanes, it's in the people you work with. And when I was in the large high altitude center, which is where I started, I saw what that meant, that it has to do with the airspace boundaries and the way that controllers do boundary work, which means moving airplanes across the boundaries of the sky and moving them across the facilities on the ground. And that the airspace,
I have to ask you to wrap up, unfortunately.
The airspace shapes the place, the architecture, the organization, and technology, and as well as the work in the various facilities. So it shows the variation in the work in what is allegedly a standardized system. Thank you.
All right, and next up is Alfred Young Jr., who is professor of sociology, Afro-American and African studies, and also public policy at the University of Michigan.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. Pardon that, my appreciation at being invited to this very stimulating conversation. I will allow this virtual connection to enable me to pretend that I'm experiencing December in the Bay Area rather than the state of Michigan, where I happen to be. But aside from that, I want to acknowledge the extreme importance of the conversation today about comparison and comparative ethnography. Obviously, comparison is an omnipresent part of any ethnographic endeavor, even if it's not made explicit in ethnographers writing about their research. As the chapters of this book reveal, comparative thinking remains in the minds of ethnographers if not in their actual practice when in the field. There is so much to say about the range of ideas brought forth in this book, and I would imagine that there's even so much more for me to ponder and think about had I had even more time to step into this material and reflect upon its meaning for someone that, as I'll explain in a minute, stands aside to the project of formal ethnography. That being the case, I will probably have more questions and more to say about this work when this conversation is over. But for present purposes, I want to provide some brief remarks that emerge as I continue to process the complexities raised in this work. First, a note of clarification. As some others have said earlier, I have never self-identified as an ethnographer, certainly not the kind of tried and true ethnographer that is the focus of attention in this book and much of our conversation today. I was certainly trained in that tradition, and as a graduate student, aggressively sought out the courses and counsel from anthropologists and others in the social sciences beyond sociology to inform my understanding of and approach to the craft of ethnography. But ultimately, because I sought to center my work on how people explain their visions of social reality, rather than how they interactively engage social reality, I became what I refer to as an ethnographic interviewer. However, doing so mandated that I practice a particular form of ethnography prior to and in the course of conducting my interview-based research. And it is as an observer, a reader, a student of this volume, rather than being a contributor to it, I found so much that was stimulating and informative that enabled me to rethink this moment of what I call a kind of early or pre-ethnography to the ethnographic interview moment. And I explain this by saying that that is in virtually every site where I've conducted my research, I have spent some initial time observing people in the communities in which I conducted my studies. In some cases, this occurred several weeks before I formally engaged the research project, in others several years before engaging the project. And it is through this work in particular that I've begun to rethink these moments of what I call pre-engagement as creating a basis for some important comparative ethnographic considerations. Among many other considerations, what comes to mind for me in thinking about the comparative dimension of what I call my quasi-ethnographic endeavor is how much it enables me to think about that which may appear to be as quotidian social experiences or circumstances, but ones that ultimately play a critical role in shaping the ethnographer's eye and the analytical lens they apply to the people that they study. And what I'm pointing to here is a way in which this work enables us to rethink the moment of pre-engagement that for ethnographers, for ethnographic interviewers, often gets crystallized in our research, in our writing, as the explanation of immersion into the field, right? How we came to know our sites, how we came to develop rapport with people that we study. All important, all critical for our ability to produce good work, to produce convincing work for our audiences. But I also think that this moment of pre-engagement, as one thinks about how it unfolds across different projects and across different sites, lends itself to more focused considerations of the analytical lens that we bring to our work. It's almost a way in which we can imagine a comparative consideration of epistemology and how we go about doing our work. That what we see, what we think about, what we feel in later sites is wholly informed by what we saw, thought about, and felt in our previous sites. For me, this came to light most centrally in some very recent work that I've done that, unlike what I've done for the past 20 or so years in my career, where I centered my work on the experiences of large city, low-income African-American men, I turned to the small city context in the past couple of years for some recent work. And there were very many distinctions, differences, certainly size being one of them, that was significant in my thinking about what it meant to invest in a small city, a city of tens of thousands of people rather than close to millions, which has been the point of consideration of earlier research. In turning to the small city, I began to realize, and I'm still in the process of making sense of on the basis of the commentaries in this volume, how the analytical eye is shaped in particular ways that's been informed by periods of prior research. By way of example, being in the small city for me initially became a moment to think differently about African Americans in urban space. But one of the realizations I made, or one of the points that I thought about, is not just simply the time of pre-immersion into this site, but the manner in which I was in this space that compared critically with the ways in which I entered other spaces. Long story short, the city I studied was the city I frequented as a consumer of goods, as a consumer of cultural artifacts, cultural experiences that pertain to the African American community. That had not been common for many of my points of entry in research in larger cities. That already situated certain issues, certain points of consideration, certain thoughts that guided what was in very many ways the same kinds of field questions that I brought to the people that I was inquiring about. But a basis to think differently about what it meant to that population as predicated upon a very different pattern of immersion and involvement with that space became a way for me to think about and critically compare experiences of immersion across spaces and across time. Another key point of consideration had to do with what it is that people talked about and didn't talk about, and how vivid that became for me on the basis of an intellectual history of exploring life in big cities. The ability to grasp what's not spoken about, what's not articulated in the case of small city African Americans, no mention or consideration of a large, vibrant, white-collar professional downtown that centered images of good work, opportunities, a good life. Right? And the ability to realize and think that through, that rests on the background of decades of intervention and research in large cities, where immediate comparison could be from where people live to that downtown area miles away that seem to visibly appear to people, visibly, sometimes just cognitively, as a site of possibility. So all this to say that this book, the work of the contributors, indeed the conversation that we're having today, enables me to advance upon my own thinking and invite you to think more broadly about this notion of the early engagement of sites, and to think beyond the question of how we facilitate rapport, comfort, familiarity with our sites, with the people we study, with the spaces they live in. But more critically, how different forms of engagement across different sites sharpen, heighten our recognition of certain research questions, certain experiences, even if we ask the same questions to people in these different sites. They heighten our capacity to think about how they respond to us and engage us, because that rests again on a history of such conduct in other sites and other settings. And so I invite us to think a little bit more about that novel way of embracing the comparative in the work that we do. Not simply that we've got new questions or the same questions in a different site, but our capacity to imagine, interpret, have a feel for them is so critically linked to our own history of engaging sites and our own comparative thinking about differences across sites. I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop there and look forward to more conversation.
Okay, thank you. And next up is Lynn Chancer, who is professor of sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York.
I'm unmuted, right? You can hear me, Corey? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm very glad to be here and to be part of this volume. I think my task was 8 minutes. I don't know if I've ever managed 8 minutes in my life, but I'll give it a shot and see how far I get. But I was going to summarize a little bit of my piece in the volume. I am also, like Tom and other people have said, considers myself more of a theorist and a qualitative person than an ethnographer. On the other hand, I have a long-standing interest that came through a little in this piece in psychosocial analysis and reflexivity, and an equally long-standing interest in the sociology of sociology, and also in looking at the sociology of ethnography. Why do ethnographers study what they do, for what reason, and to sort of theorize that a little bit. Specifically in the article I wrote with this volume, I became interested in a patterned tendency I was noting in US ethnography and sociology in particular, to study down more than to study elites. And I found myself checking out that pattern a little bit empirically and asking why. And if it's been the case that ethnographers have tended to study down more than elites, what is there a comparative aspect to that in particular, which got me interested in looking a little bit about whether that question is similarly the case in France as well as in the United States. I suspected that it could be a little bit different in France, and found myself, in fact, investigating and seeing two possible reasons why in the French context studying elites might have been more established. One reason could be the ongoing influence, theoretically and otherwise, of Pierre Bourdieu in terms of studying class and sort of taking as a basic tenet that class is relational, and that to study one end of the class spectrum rather than across the class spectrum, it would seem might not make sense, again, as a sort of foundational theoretical orientation. But secondly, as I started to do research, I was told about and then became very interested in the work of, in France, Les Pinson-Charlot, a couple who studied under Bourdieu initially and then devoted their entire careers to writing about elites, and was sort of fascinated to find out that at least some ethnographers in the US that I came and talked about or in the process of writing this piece were not that familiar with Les Pinson-Charlot and their sort of lifelong studies of elites. And once that I started to look into the work of Les Pinson-Charlot in the French context, it also brought up, and I reflected in this piece a little bit on whether I think the studying down rather than up in the US is often thought to be a problem of access. And so I talk very much about the access hypothesis, which certainly makes sense and is certainly the case to a large extent. But if there is any kind of comparative difference at all. And also in the US, I found many, of course, there's I think a shift, which I talk about in the piece, a large shift going on toward more studies of elites, and lots of people have been doing it, which raised the question of, is it really access, or has the pattern in the past been something about why there might be a pulling away ethnographically from studying elites? Was there something that could be going on that has to do with disposition and not solely or exclusively with questions of access? So I reflected in the piece about that, and I concluded, which, I'll see if I can really in fact do this in 8 minutes, but I concluded the piece with a consideration of something that strikes me as extremely important for ethnographers and for a sociology of ethnography. Why study elites anyway? Like, if one were to do this, what are the benefits, possible benefits of doing so? And one thing I talked about 4 factors, first being cultural and ideological, and again, that question going back to Bourdieu of relationality. A second factor I talked about in terms of commonalities. This is a deeper philosophical question, but how to understand human actions in situations of power and powerlessness across social categories. Are there commonalities between us that are important to look at? That brings up questions of reflexivity, again, as a third point, that studying elites also calls attention to who we are, our own background in relation to what we study, and sort of insists upon the importance of, in fact, reflexivity. And a fourth philosophical reason goes back to my first book that I keep wanting to revisit and write more about, which I hope to do, which was called Sadomasochism in Everyday Life, Dynamics of Power and Powerlessness, and it talked about how people can transform from positions of relative powerlessness to greater power. And looking at elites gives one a sense of, would one do differently? Why do people do what they do? And if in fact power relations transform, will people not repeat what was happened? Why and how will they vary? So can we learn a great deal in insight-wise from studying elites? And my final point is whether anything about the chapter in the book is generalizable that I wrote about the question of studying up or down and studying elites. And I think the generalizable question is, for ethnographers, is there sometimes a problem in the possibility of studying groups who we might worry that we won't relate to, that we could find distasteful, that we find in some ways groups that we wish to avoid? And is that a problem that's generalizable? So, you know, beyond the case, beyond the book, beyond the case, Corey, I'm finding myself wondering and starting to look into to what extent are sociologists studying people who are politically different? Are we studying people who, let's say, were supportive of Trump, who support authoritarians in a variety of different societies? And is there sometimes a hesitancy in ethnographically studying groups that it's very, very hard, or we suspect at some level may be hard to understand? And is that, in fact, a good reason to study such group? So I hope to take some of the impulses that went into the piece in Beyond the Case and apply it perhaps to other cases as well. That's it.
Great, thank you. That was pretty close to 8 minutes, which I realize is very hard. So thank all of you for enduring that. Next up is Dan Dohan, who is professor of health policy, surgery, and humanities and social sciences at the University of California, San Francisco.
Thanks, Corey, and thanks to all the organizers. And this has been a terrific delight for me. I don't sit in a department of sociology, so having the opportunity to hang out and hear about the sort of thoughtful approaches to ethnography and research and all the topics that have been discussed here today is really fantastic. On the other hand, I think I'm probably the only professor of surgery here, although I would urge you not to come to me if you actually need any procedures done, because I actually am not very handy with the scalpel. That said, what I want to talk today is about the role of ethnography and comparative ethnography in the context of biomedicine and health, which is where I do my work. And you know, I have a couple of points here. It's not a real sort of full essay, but just a couple of observations I wanted to share. First of all, one of the interesting things that I've loved about doing ethnography in the context of health and medicine is that it's such a sort of wonderfully welcoming perspective within the medical profession. And that I've noticed it happens in two ways. First of all, for clinicians are very sympathetic to the notion of narrative and the notion of something ineffable that comes from an interaction with an individual and hearing about their story and history and putting that together with a variety of different types of data. And there's a real sympathy there. On the other hand, talking to basic scientists within the biomedical field, they're very sympathetic to arguments that focus on mechanisms and understanding what is connected to what. And ethnographers are very good at that sort of detailed type of work of understanding exactly how one thing flows from another, how these things are connected together. And they're very sympathetic to very complex stories, which of course ethnographers love to tell. So I've noticed that that's one very sort of nice way in which my work connects with my colleagues here at UCSF at the medical school. It's also striking to me that grounded theory, which has become so dominant within research on health and medicine has emerged. It actually, was largely championed at UCSF. It has a phenomenological perspective, and there's an incredible irony that these scientists and hardcore health scientists sort of unknowingly embrace a phenomenological and sort of hermeneutical approach to understanding social life. I'm always struck by that irony. And actually, one of the things that I really enjoy is when I talk to my colleagues and see which of them sort of are able to interpret a wink, which of them see a twitch, and the extent to which they have that self-awareness to appreciate the difference between those two things and really embrace that sort of ethnographic gaze. So that's one set of observation. The second set is, as reflected in this chapter, my colleague Alyssa Bernstein, who's an anthropologist and isn't available today, and we really are searching for ways to make our work relevant to the health sciences, and technology has been a way to do that. So we have both developed and embraced techniques for bringing together many cases comparatively. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, except just to point out that within our professional and academic pathways, that is a very important way of communicating with our colleagues that we are interested in sort of advancing understanding of what's happening in important issues. Some of those are important issues in the realm of health and medicine, but more particularly, they're important issues in the realm of policy and sort of well-being of populations and of people. And I think that has been an approach that we have embraced with technology as a language to communicate that to our colleagues, and I think has been very much appreciated by them. I should also point out that our work is funded by the National Institute of Health, which a couple of years ago sort of transformed the way they asked people to scientifically review their funding proposals to focus on rigor and reproducibility. And I have found that to be an extremely wonderful way to think ethnographically. There's a way in which validity and reliability are our standard terms in the social sciences. That's the methods I learned. But rigor and reproducibility works a lot better for an ethnographer in the sense that if you can show both why you're doing what you're doing, and it turns out that's sort of more inductive work and more iterative work is very consistent with a rigorous approach to understanding one's research object. And reproducibility, both in terms of data collection, data analysis, and data presentation, also is a bar that ethnographers can easily clear because we're so close to our data. We're so close to the people with whom we work, and we can show that to other scientists, and they sort of get it. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the way that our work as ethnographers has aligned more closely with the basic biomedical scientific perspectives that I'm finding at the NIH. And I'd just like to end with a couple of thoughts on the topic that Corey raised at the beginning of the presentation, which is in this era of COVID, the intense need for ethnographic insights has never been more obvious or more important. We don't know anything about why certain groups are particularly susceptible to COVID transmission and infection. We know very little about why certain groups are so impacted by the illness when they become infected. We know almost nothing about which groups may embrace vaccines and how to protect ourselves as a society. And I really think that given the sort of deep meanings that people associate with these issues, that ethnography is really one of the only ways to go about it. So I know that it's incredibly challenging to do ethnography quickly, and especially to do it quickly with rigor and reproducibility in a field such as COVID that is changing every couple of weeks. And yet it seems to me that it is an incredible necessity for us to think about that challenge. It's certainly something that Alyssa and I have been brought into by many of our colleagues who are fielding studies of COVID susceptibility and how to respond to it appropriately. And I would just leave that as sort of an incredibly important way in which ethnographers shape practice. We've talked a little bit about ethnography and social movements, ethnography and the relationships to policy, but it's actually in shaping practice and making practice more evidence-based and making it more grounded in the real world and the real realities of individuals and groups that I think it has particular salience and importance. And so that's what's motivated some of the work that we've been trying to do. And I really look forward to further discussion with this incredible group. And thanks again for the opportunity.
Okay, and with that, we are going to open it up for Q&A, and Elise Minchin is going to be asking the questions. If you asked a question and your name got dropped off, that's my fault because I was moving things around in Google Documents. And if it's directed to somebody, that is just because we're trying to direct them to different people for whom it might be relevant. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. This first question is from Dustin Mabry for Dr. Vaughn. Please describe a big surprise you encountered in a project, something you didn't expect and then came to guide the project in meaningful ways. You're muted.
I see. What a great question. I've been surprised so many times, mostly when I don't know what I'm doing. But people, when you're hanging around for a long time in a research project, people will say things to you in a casual setting that really attract your attention. So, for example, the example I gave before about it's not the airplanes that are stressed of this job, it's the people you work with, was really an important turning point for me. But there were other things. They all come from different social classes. And in a lunch line, one controller said, it's really hard to work with people so much different from you, but we're all bound together by that little free zone of terror we feel when we think we've missed something that just stops you in your tracks. In uncoupling, I was very surprised at how people trusted me and told me secrets as a stranger to them. And maybe it was because they felt more comfortable with the stranger. But I asked them to tell me about their relationship from the moment they started feeling something was seriously wrong. And so they told a chronological account. And in doing the telling, they were putting the chronology together. And I think that that was one of the things that propelled them to tell me things they might not have told other people. So, for example, I had two people tell me about that they had abused their wives. And I certainly carried forward, but I'd never had that happen before. The other thing is when you discover your hypothesis is totally wrong and you have to start over. And so that's what I call a negative surprise, but it ends up to be better in the end.
Thank you. And this next question is for Lynn Chancer. How do ethnographies where those from the lower classes study up complicate your remarks? What about those with elite backgrounds studying elites?
You're asking, are there exceptions to that sometimes people from elite backgrounds study elites? Is that what you're saying? What about exceptions?
How do those ethnographies complicate things?
Yeah, well, what I think is the case, and it's in the chapter I wrote for this volume, is that there are very interesting shifts that have started to take place. So in terms of the exceptions or complications, I think both in France and the United States, there's definitely a group of scholars who have started very explicitly to think about studying elites. There have been, I worked with a few people on a mini conference at the Easterns 2 years ago, and there's a shift that has taken place. And in many cases, the shift involves people who have studied elites, from Seamus Khan to a number of people in France, Jules Naudet. There's quite a few people who are engaged with this, and they are using connections that they have. So I think it's interesting. I mean, in terms of, does it complicate it? It just suggests that there is, I think, some noticing of this pattern that had started to take place. And at least my sense of many scholars is that they've been concerned about worsening inequalities globally, and that it started to seem very, very logical to look at the role that elites are playing in social reproduction very explicitly. So I think there is a shift taking place that shows ethnographers becoming themselves cognizant of their own patterns in the very process of making those patterns and shifting them.
Thank you. This next question is for Dan Dohan. There have been some mentions of generalizability. I'm curious to know if you regularly receive questions about the generalizability of your findings and how you usually respond to that. If generalizability is a goal for you, on what basis do you claim to be able to generalize?
It's a great question. Typically, when generalizability is mentioned as a concern, I look for the exits and try to avoid the question, but it's not possible. I mean, I think that the way that we've tried to do that is at once to give it our best try to come with a generalizable answer, and at the same time to recognize the limitations in what we're able to speak to. And I guess there are two thoughts I would add more specifically. One is there's actually a question in the chat about having one ethnographer observe multiple sites versus having multiple researchers do comparative ethnography. And I think one thing that we found, we do a lot of ethnography where we have multiple observers, actually observers with different levels of expertise and experience doing ethnography, as well as different levels of expertise and knowledge of the clinical sites or the sites, the social sites where they're doing the work. And one of the things that emerges from that is it's possible to see which aspects of everyday life in those settings are recognizable to everyone and which things are recognizable just to certain types of observers more readily than to others. So I think that having multiple people involved in a project actually can in some ways enhance one's comfort about a certain type of generalizability, which is, are you seeing the same thing in that site over and over again? And I think that's helpful. And then, the other piece of the generalizability claim is I think there is a very strong tendency within the social science, especially, to be caught in this notion of sort of general linear reality, where there's this notion of a variable that is, has an effect on another variable. And again, back to my comment about the sort of sympathy around specific mechanisms that may account for particular types of behaviors or outcomes or meanings, or whatever it may be that's of interest to an ethnographer. I think getting people out of the framework of expecting there to be a variable that has a certain distribution, and if it goes up or down, that makes another variable go up and down. I think to the extent that we can get people out of that notion of generalizability, it's very helpful, because then it helps us think about what are the social processes we see over and over again in a particular context, as opposed to in what way is this one spot that you've seen generalizable or typical of a wide variety of different settings. I think that second type of generalizability is very, very difficult for ethnographers, but that first type actually is something that we have some strength at.
Thank you. This next question is for Al Young. I wonder how to conduct thick, in-depth interviews online when the human interaction, the surrounding, and the embodied dispositions are missing. I personally find it incredibly hard, thus I would love to know your suggestions.
Wow. I will admit it first that I think I'm going to be disappointing, because I've actually spent the better part of the last few months trying to figure out how that can happen to avoid the kind of concerns that are embedded in the question. And at this point, I have simply fallen back on some sense of comfort with doing such interviews with people from places that are one's already familiar with. So again, everything that I said about the pre-engagement period, I've not tried to, nor do I anticipate doing Zoom-based or other kinds of virtual interviews in settings that I haven't had some kind of physically intimate connection to. I'm at a loss for how one can do that, how one can capture those kinds of nuances and subtleties. I certainly invite the other panelists to jump in and maybe they have a response. But it's a question that keeps me up at night. Probably will tonight, given that it's asked again. But again, I've avoided it and fallen back upon people from spaces that I've already had some connection to.
Thank you.
Did anybody else want to jump in on that one? I'd be interested to hear approaches.
I've done some interviews online this spring, and I would say there's a lot of variability. In my experience, I would say the rule of thumb is, to me, they're about 80%, 75 to 80% as good as an interview in person. This is with strangers. But somebody is vouching for me when I get introduced to these people. This is not a cold call. So I meet somebody and I say, do you know anybody who's wealthy? And I said, next time you talk to them, maybe you could see if they'd be willing to talk to me. I have a phone call. By agreeing to talk to me, you're not agreeing to be study, but just be interviewed to let me tell you about it. And so I have somebody, and some of them I think are pretty good, and some of them are a disaster. They're more likely to end very abruptly sometimes. But I think it is, but as you say, it's vastly better to know somebody in person. But I think it is workable in some, and I think multiple interviews with the same person can be a useful strategy, because essentially you give up on the first one, but then maybe the second and third one might be better.
I'll just say very briefly, I've done a few interviews recently, and I think I've sort of already accepted in my head, I'm looking for a different kind of data than with, as you know, I was saying, places that I already know well. I know maybe I've met the people through more field research, and then I'm sitting down to get a life history. I'm not expecting to do that. I've actually been chatting with some directors of residential mental health treatment facilities that people I met in my fieldwork I know had gone to, and I've just been getting sort of more like, tell me about the day-to-day routine, tell me about your clinical practices, and those don't require necessarily as much kind of trust and rapport building. If I had to try to elicit more personal information, I'm not sure how that would go. But so I've just sort of shifted what I prioritize for the moment, and then we'll see what happens in the future.
And I think Ido had a comment too.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to speak to the previous question about generalizability just briefly, because I think that's a question that every ethnographer gets in their job talk, more or less. That's kind of the dreaded. But one of the things that at least I think is that these questions about generalizability, and I think that has to do with comparison. Assume that your study kind of exists in a vacuum, that like your study exists in a vacuum, and therefore it has to capture everything. And if it doesn't, if you don't show me how this is either typical or generalizable or happens everywhere, then there's something. But our work is at least one way that I think one can answer that, not the only way, obviously, is to say, again, that our work is always in relation to other work and in relation to a whole conversation. And generalizability, the question is not whether your data is generalizable. The question is whether what you're saying would change the way that other people see what they are seeing and do what they're doing or interpret the results. I mean, that is the mode of moving outwards, I think, that ethnography should aspire to.
Thank you all for those answers. This next question is for Neil Gong. Although we can excavate the complexity of real life, how can we justify those complexities are not merely outliers if we only focus on one case?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Although we can excavate the complexity of real life, how can we justify those complexities are not merely outliers if we only focus on one case?
I suppose one answer is that we sort of can't. But again, as Ito was just saying, we don't exist in a vacuum. So even if one is not formally doing comparisons of multiple sites or across time or different ways we've discussed comparison, one is always making these shadow comparisons with things we've read, or you're directly in dialogue with other people, in which case you could get a better sense of the uniqueness or sort of more typicality of what you're looking at. But I'm sure other people have thoughts on this as well.
I do. I'd like to respond to that. There's something about the way a project is constructed and the connections that the author makes between the pieces of the puzzle that makes a single case more convincing. So if just to take the iconic case of Street Corner Society, you know, it's like Buravoy's work in Manufacturing Consent, that these are one of the first two pieces I can recall where the authors spoke in the first person, so that you saw their thinking in places, how their experience in the setting was affecting them, and which was very powerful. But they also had staying power for other reasons. When for Street Corner Society, this took on a larger issue that was prominent at the time, that argued, based on the Chicago School of Sociology, that the ecological studies that showed that that working class people were disorganized, social disorganization theory. And what he showed was that it was totally organized. It was just differently organized than the middle class white people who were doing the research. And then in the individual cases, he would theorize small parts of it. And that's when you saw the first person writing. And so it became iconic, but I have always thought of it as historical sociology, historical ethnography, I'm sorry, because it's set in a time and place that mark it, both the language that he did, but the analysis and the people as well. And that those things come through so strongly that in other pieces where people have a significant concept, and the concept itself carries the message of the author and transforms. It's a way that theory travels. There's a concept that's developed in the work that is analogical to what other people see in their data. And so they don't do the comparison case themselves, but the concept does the work for them. So I think there are those ways where an individual case can really make a difference, and many do. Most of them do, or we wouldn't be talking about them today.
Thank you. And this question is actually going to be our last question, and this is for Diane Vaughn. What is the difference between a digital or archival ethnography compared to content analysis of online media or histography?
Well, go ahead.
Basically, what makes something an ethnography if you're not actually with people in person?
I've thought about this in relation to how ethnography has to rise to the challenge of being carried out in a pandemic. And I've seen, there are two ways I've thought. One is that we can work with historical ethnography in terms of oral histories like Corita Brown's work. And that, for example, Columbia has an oral history project where data is available. That's one way. And the other way is some of our graduate students are doing online work. And one response to Tom's comment about social media and the kind of communities that develop. So there's one project where 2 students are working on expertise, and they found a social media group of people who have either been exposed to or had the coronavirus. And they have an online site, and they discuss the most recent data or symptoms. People talk about symptoms in progress, and they're trying to nail down what the researchers are trying to nail down, how they decide what is a demonstration of expertise among them, and how they choose among the facts, that various contradictory facts that are going on. And they've sorted through by looking at the language exchanged and the reaction to people who come in who have credentials to be experts, and how they're sanctioned and disqualified from the group. And the whole thing is about the development of lay expertise and the exchange of knowledge in what is a select community. So that's another way.
After we've been, via the book and emails and all of this, and I think a lot of great ideas were explored here today. Thanks so much to everyone, from the panelists and book contributors, to everyone involved at SIR, and for helping this thing come off so well. And then thanks so much to all of the viewers with your great questions and comments. And then I believe it's in the chat, but we'll at 3 we'll convene for this this digital mixer thing. And I've never been in one of these before, so I guess I'll see how it works.
And thank you, Corey and Neil, for organizing.
Thank you so much. It's been really great.
Thank you so much. I guess I'll say a couple of things because we have a few minutes. I just really like this discussion of social disorganization, and because Aaron Sickerell could not be here, I want to make one of his points about fixed choice questions and structural invariance with accountable exceptions. Social disorganization, or rather social organization, may be the one thing that ethnographers that don't talk to each other agree on, which is that it's potentially a methodological artifact of counting broken windows rather than observing social ecology. I think this was a really generative discussion. I just want to thank again everybody that contributed to the book, who showed up today, everybody that helped. And I just, one more plug, check out cer.berkeley.edu to see the sort of things that are happening at Berkeley. And if you would like to join us in the virtual chat set up by another Arizona graduate student, Kelsey Gonzalez, please do. It is not going to be moderated, so it's, old school internet, but just thank you all again. I'm so grateful to have this discussion.